Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us for another opera talk with Jeffrey Engel as he educates us about Fedora. All yours, Jeffrey.
So good afternoon and welcome to Fedora. I'm going to start a little bit differently this time. Normally I'll play a piece of music by a composer who sounds like the composer we're going to discuss to kind of fool you. But instead, I thought I would start with the highlight of this opera, which is a very short aria, just a minute and a half, and play you an extended version, so don't be tricked by this. For some reason, they've taken well, it's the same theme that you have of the aria. It appears as an orchestral intermezzo in Act 2 after the aria has been sung. And on this recording, they're using that intermezzo at the beginning, and then you hear the tenor sing. But it's very short, and it's quite beautiful. And it's the following. Well, that's entitled Amore te vieta. So tenor sings it in Act 2, sort of a declaration of love for Fedora. Now, the opera is not terribly well known. It's not often performed, mainly because it's got this one highlight, not too much else. The music is nice, but I don't know if it really justifies it to be part of the permanent repertory. The composer, Umberto Giordano, also not a household name. and is known today basically for two operas, a little bit for Fedora, for really the opera-loving public, and then Andrea Chenier, which is more of a repertory opera, fringe repertory. And Giordano belongs to this group that immediately followed Verdi. Verdi stops composing operas in 1893. Falstaff is his last. And immediately that year, you have Manon Lescaut Puccini, which launches Puccini's career and furthers this young group of composers named the Giovane Scuola, the young school. And that would include Pietro Mascagni, Leoncavallo, Giordano, composer we did a year or two ago, Francesco Cilea, when we did Adriano Le Couvreur. And all of them belong to this period we call Verismo. And it'll be very popular and successful for a couple of decades and kind of fade out, though elements of it will continue on in other operas. And Verismo means realism. Maybe a more literal translation is truthism. And it emanated from a literary movement that began in the 1880s. It was an Italian literary movement, which in itself was an outgrowth of two French literary movements. And the first was called realism, and the second was called naturalism. Now, all this is a part of the 19th century's Romantic era, Romanticism, this explosion of passion and emotion, and these romantics that were living volcanoes of passion and emotion. And the subjects would deal with heroes and myths and legends, sometimes historical, but you could play with the facts. There wasn't a demand for factual accuracy in Romanticism. It was more you followed the heart and the head. And you would have some reactions to Romanticism. Even though Romanticism is going to last into the 20th century, you're still going to have reactions against it. And one of them takes place in the 1830s, is a literary movement, which was called realism. And this is going to be in France. Now, this would include three authors, the most important. There'd be Stendhal, Honoré de Balzac. They were more city composers, whereas you have Flaubert and Madame Bovary, who depicted life in the provinces, and you got an idea of what life was like in the provinces. And these works were characterized by factual accuracy. They weren't telling fanciful tales. And when you have changes of movements or styles, for whatever reason, it always begins in literature, then it influences art, and then lastly, music. And in this case, let's say this new style of realism, where you're dealing with real people, real life situations. And for the most part, you're dealing with lower class people and everyday events. This is going to influence painting very soon. And one of the painters affected by it was Gustave Courbet. He was born in 1819, dies in 1877. And he's born in eastern France in the region called the Jura, a little village called Ornans. And if you know at all the map of France, you've got the city of Besançon, which was the hometown of Victor Hugo. And another one of these cities with 7 hills like Rome and Edinburgh. There are actually many of them. And it's just south of it in a valley called La Vallée de la Loue, the Loue River. And he was very much inspired to paint everyday people, hitchhikers, villagers. And this was not typical of the day. And in 1849, he comes out with a painting called The Burial at Ornans. And this was a huge canvas depicting a very everyday type of event, which was the burial of a villager. And it caused quite a bit of controversy. because why would you devote a huge canvas to such a, what was seen as a silly event? Now, I studied art history for a year at the Sorbonne and had this extraordinary professor, probably the best professor I've ever had anywhere, named André Fermigier. And the class I took, and I say class, it wasn't a classroom, it was an auditorium with 200 students, almost all of them girls. And the course was called Courbet and Impressionism. I was not an impressionist, he led into impressionism. But what was wonderful about Fermigier's take on this was to start with David and the neoclassical period and show how that got to Courbet and realism and how that led to impressionism. And while he's doing this, he's also fitting in the literature of the day, the social life of the French at that time, music, architecture, would weave this all together. He was simply brilliant. And I remember him showing this picture of the burial at Ornans, and he pointed out reasons why it was controversial. First, that it was so realistic and going against the trends, but Courbet also was not following sort of the classical rules of painting of the day. And I was going to show you a picture of it. Unfortunately, I have a very small likeness of it. I would suggest afterwards you go online, look up Courbet, Courbet, and burial at Ornans. And if you do, you'll see on the left of the painting, you've got a great group of villagers, and there's a priest who's in charge of the ceremony. And a little bit towards the right, there's a dog, very handsome dog. The dog isn't looking at everything going on to the left. He's looking at the right where there's nothing. And this was considered scandalous in that day. And one reason why this picture caused such controversy. Well, in 1855, we have the Exposition Universelle. It's the first of the great ones in Paris. They happen every 10 or 11 years. And painters of the day could submit paintings to a jury that would decide whether they could be exhibited or not. Of course, Courbet was refused. He was a rebel. So what does he do? He opens up his own gallery off the Champs-Élysées, kind of like off Broadway. And he exhibited 43 of his paintings. And above the door, huge sign that you couldn't miss said Courbet Réaliste. So we know where he stood. Now, realism is going to come into another type of style, which is going to be naturalism. And the most important exponent of this style, again, we're talking about literature, is Émile Zola, might be a name familiar to you, got involved in the Dreyfus trial of the 1890s, defended Dreyfus, wrote a pamphlet called J'accuse, I accuse, made him even more famous than he was. But in naturalism, you certainly dealt with the lower classes. And you talked about, or you wrote about, the ugliest aspects of lives, the most unattractive elements. And so these two styles are going to lead to Verismo in Italy. And this is going to come about in the 1880s. And the most famous of the Verismo writers will be Giovanni Vega. He was born in 1840, same year as Monet, dies in 1922, 4 years before the death of Monet. That's their only connection. And he's born in Catania, dies in Catania, Sicily, and he wrote about everyday Sicilian life. And very often, these dramas were rather unpleasant. They could be full of passion, but also there were shockers, there were murders involved. And in 1884, he is going to come out with what's considered the first Verissimo literary work, which is Cavalleria Rusticana, which should ring a bell. Of course, that's the opera by Mascagni, and it was based on first a short story and then a dramatization of the short story by Vega. So to give you an idea of how unpleasant these stories can be, I haven't read the play or the short story, but I'm sure that the opera follows pretty closely. So if we're looking at the plot of Cavalleria, We have a young girl, Santuzza, who's in love with Turiddu, and I believe the implication is that she's had a child by him. But now he's off and running to be with someone else. Her name is Lola, who's the wife of Alfio, and they're having an affair. Santuzza, obviously, quite upset by it. And as she's going to church, she bumps into him on Easter Sunday and curses him, which results in him being murdered by Alfio or killed in a duel. This is the type of drama you're going to get with the Verismo. And he's also going to write another play, which was called La Lupa, the she-wolf, and it's about an oversexed woman who is murdered during a Good Friday parade. So this is kind of unpleasant stuff. But it is going to become rather popular and attract a number of composers to use these dramas as plots for their operas. Puccini would be in that group. And in fact, he goes down to Sicily to meet with Vega because he wants to set La Lupa to music. In fact, he wrote some music for it. And in this idea of realism, which Puccini was, he believed this full-heartedly in a number of his operas. For example, in Tosca, and again, accuracy of fact. You have in Tosca, the beginning of Act 3, you hear the chimes of St. Peter's, and Puccini made sure that the tones of the chimes duplicated the exact chimes of St. Peter's. Or at the beginning of Act 2, a cantata is being given for Queen Caroline. Tosca, who's an opera singer, is going to sing in the cantata. This is taking place in 1800, the time of Napoleon's conquest, certainly the first attempted conquest of Italy. And it's believed that he has been defeated in the Battle of Marengo, and there's this great celebration. And one of Napoleon's favorite composers was Giovanni Paisiello. Now, Puccini could have written music for the cantata, but he wanted this to be realistic, so he took a work by Paisiello and used it at the beginning of Act 2 and gave it to Florio Tosca to sing. So we have the same thing with Puccini when he goes down to Sicily, though Tosca's later. This is around 1896. He's going to take photographs of Sicilian countryside, of the costumes of various locales that he can use in the sets, and of course, costumes in his opera, and he composes some music to this. But he found the subject so unattractive that he abandoned the idea, but the music he wrote, he will use in his next opera, which is the year of 1896, which is La Boheme. It's what we call recycling, and all composers would do this. So we have this style of Verissimo, which is in a way a little bit difficult to define because we have operas that are defined as being Verissimo, but they only have a few elements of Verissimo in them. Or we have operas that are not considered Verissimo, but have more elements of Verissimo in them than operas that are deemed to be Verissimo. It gets a little bit confusing. But Giordano does fit into this title of Verissimo, though not always following exactly the idea of it, because it is supposed to be about the lower classes and their struggles, their tribulations. And yet Fedora has nothing to do with that. It's about princes and counts. So again, it's hard to define. So if we take a look at Giordano, and this is not easy because there isn't a lot of information out there about exactly who he was. Puccini, we know he loved anything with a motor. He loved fast cars. He loved yachts. Mascagni, we know he was a fascist, that he supported Mussolini much later, 1920s and further on. Giordano, I know nothing about him, except that he was a good fencer. He did get married, whether he had children, no idea. Very little is written about the private man. So it's a little bit difficult trying to get a picture of who he was. All I can do is give you a chronology of his musical development and musical happenings in his life. So he is born in 1867. He's born in what is today a fairly large town. It's about the size of Bridgeport, called Foggia. This is in the Apulia section of Italy. This is southeast part of the boot. And his father, and say, now here we get this problem, we get involved in the perils of research. The 1908 Groves Dictionary of Music and Musicians says that his father was an artisan. The 1954 Groves confirms that. The 1980 Groves says he was a pharmacist. And the 1994 Opera Groves, which is devoted just to opera, says he was a chemist. So which one do you choose? Well, I found another author who I trust. He was a very good opera historian named William Weaver, and he says that he was a pharmacist. So I'm going pharmacist here. In any case, he wasn't musical, and he did not want his son to become a composer. I wanted him to become a fencing master, and apparently he did become a rather good fencer. But he will study privately in Foggia. And then in 1880, he enters into the Naples Conservatory. That's the same year that Puccini and Mascagni, who for about 6 months were roommates, enter conservatory, but they're in the north. They're at the Milano Conservatory. And once again, I did a lot of cross-referencing, reading biographies of Puccini, Mascagni, anyone I could get my hands on. And they hardly ever mention Giordano. I have no idea if there was any connection between he and Puccini. They were the same generation. They were, 9 years apart. Mascagni helped Giordano early on in his career, but aside from that, no further information. No idea if he knew Leoncavallo or not. Certainly, they all heard each other's music because they were all fascinated by new works coming out. And as I'll show you a little bit later on, Puccini was even influenced by Giordano for sort of a strange section in one of his later operas. So anyway, he's at the conservatory, he stays there 10 years till 1890. At one point, he has to drop out because of some unspecified family drama, but he comes back. And in 1889, he takes part in the Concorso Sanzogno. This was a compositional prize or competition. And Eduardo Sanzogno was a music publisher. He was fortunate to inherit, well, he came from a wealthy family, but he would inherit a printing factory and a bookstore, and he would go into music publishing and become the fierce rival of the most important publisher in Italy, the Riccardi family, which was now in its third generation, led by Giulio. This would be Puccini's publisher. And this was a fierce rivalry. They hated each other. And as I said, Riccardi would have Puccini as a client, and Sanzogno tended to get the Giordanos, the Cileas, the Leoncavallos in his group. And the rivalry was so fierce that in 1896, Sanzogno, just for one season, becomes the director of La Scala in Milano. And he refused to perform any operas by Riccardi's clientele, which caused a scandal because nobody went to the opera, and of course he was fired. But then he would take over his own theater, the Teatro Lirico, and it's in that theater that Fedora, in fact, will be premiered. But Andrea Chenier, which comes 2 years before, when Sanzogno was director of La Scala, would be performed at La Scala. So Sanzogno, who was always looking for new talent, in 1883 decides to sponsor this competition, the writing of a one-act opera. There would be eventually some 73 contestants for it. The 73 would be in 1889. The first 5 years, nobody really emerged as being very talented. You'd have a winner. And the idea was that if you won, you would get your opera performed. And sometimes even the second and third place winners would get their operas performed. But those operas performed at these first 5 contests were so poor, it was like one and done. But we come to 1889, and the winner is Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni. And Sanzogno knew that he had a hit on his hands. It'd be premiered a year later in 1890. And what he wanted was to have more than one hit in this group. Now, the second and third prize winners wrote operas that were fiascos, and their names are completely forgotten today. The sixth, you would go by the top six, so the sixth prize winner was Giordano in an opera called Marina. The judges thought that the libretto was just stupid, and the music wasn't strong enough to make it a viable option for performance. But Sanzogno sensed the talent in Giordano, and he organized a second jury in Rome at the Accademia di Santa Cecilia, and Giordano will perform the work at the piano for the jurists. Unfortunately, the ruling was the same. The libretto was impossible. And Sanzogno agreed, but nevertheless, he gave him a contract for another opera. And this was called the Malavita, or the Underworld. And it was based on a story by Salvatore di Giacomo, another one of these Verismo writers. And this is considered to be one of the more lurid plays of this era. It has to do with a village dyer who is suffering or dying from tuberculosis. And he prays to his savior and tries to make a deal that if he's able to successfully reform a village prostitute, he will be saved from tuberculosis. So he chooses a local prostitute, I think her name was Christine, but this upsets his mistress, who, by the way, is married, and her husband is a philanderer. And the mistress approaches the prostitute and tries to bribe her to abandon her dyer friend. She even threatens to kill her. And in the end, she is able to convince not the prostitute, but the dyer to abandon the prostitute, who goes back to her old life, and they continue their menage a trois. So that'll be the subject of his second opera, La Malavita, which, despite its subject, won't be successful in Italy. It was considered simply too outrageous, but it'll have a run of a couple of years in Austria and Germany. Following that, he gets a contract for another two operas that are fiascos, and now Sanzogno pretty much gives up on him. But it's Mascagni who intervenes, as well as some very wealthy patrons of Sanzogno. So they give him another chance. And so he gives to Giordano the rights to the libretto for Andrea Chenier. And that is a hit. And it remains kind of a quasi-popular opera today. So that's going to be followed in 1898 by Fedora. And as I said, Chenier will be premiered La Scala, Fedora at the Teatro Lirico. Now, Sanzogno is able to get for this one of the great divas, Italian divas of the day. Her name was Gemma Bellincioni, and she's been referred to as the Jews of song, the Eleonora Jews, the great actress of the 19th century, Italian actress, rival of Sarah Bernhardt. And she's going to sing Fedora. Now the problem is to find a suitable tenor, because you've got that extraordinary aria. And they try three tenors and they simply won't do. And Bellincioni, on a trip to Leghorn, here's a young tenor singing Canio and Pagliacci and recommends him. And he's tried out, and he's going to cause a sensation because this is Enrico Caruso. And this is his sort of his major debut. And you could say that he saved Fedora. When he sang his aria, he had to repeat it. And the opera is going to be a very fine success, but in part because of Caruso. And he's going to sing it in Paris in 1905. He gives the Met premiere in 1906. But without a Caruso, the opera is not really going to survive. And it only gets some 14 performances over the course of a few seasons. And then if my records are correct, nothing up to 1987. And I have a review of it in 1996, and I think that's the first time it was given since around the time of World War I. and it wasn't given after that. You can't perform an opera that just has one excellent aria, sadly. There's some nice music in it, but anyway, after that, he's not going to have major success. He writes a total of 12 operas. There is an opera called Siberia, which I listened to and is pretty awful. He does get an opera premiered at the Met, Madame Sans-Gêne, I think it's 1915, which is not very successful, and then stops writing operas after 1929 and resorts to writing chamber music and songs and occasional pieces. He's commissioned to write a fanfare for an Italian radio news program in 1943. Lives a long life, dies in 1948. So that takes us to the opera itself. And it's based on a play by Victorien Sardou. That name rings a bell. It's the same author of the play Tosca, which of course will be set to music by Puccini. Sardou was born 1831, dies in 1908, and began his studies as a medical student and abandoned that because he wanted to become a writer. And in 1854, he writes a play that is premiered at the Théâtre de l'Odéon. It is not successful. Writes a few more plays, again, without any success, comes down with typhoid fever, and he's nursed back to health by an actress named Mademoiselle de Brécourt, and he eventually marries her. And through her connections and other theatrical connections, he gets another premiere in 1859, which is very successful, and that launches his career. And he's going to be one of the most successful playwrights of the second half of the 19th century, writes some 70 dramas and comedies. And he was known for his plays that have been called les pièces bien faites, or plays well made. Not his idea, but this stems from an earlier French playwright, Eugène Scribe, who I've talked about in the past. Incredibly prolific, wrote some 400 plays, comedies and dramas, though you have to say he had a committee that worked with him, so that he would have one person who specialized in dialogue, one person who specialized in love scenes, and others specialized in God knows what down the line. And so he would consult them, take their ideas, and then put it together in a play, even have some people write part of the plays for him. On top of the plays, he wrote nearly 150 opera libretti and was responsible for the libretti of the most popular operas of the 1830s, late 20s, written by Aubert and Meyerbeer, the grand spectacle operas, Halévy and his La Juive, etc. And he comes up with the idea of this well-made play, and they always followed the same format. You have a course of action that is rather suspenseful. Then you come to this moment of reckoning, a climax, where all the problems of the play are resolved, and you then end with a happy ending. And Sardou is going to continue with that, though the endings aren't always happy. Certainly not in Fedora, where we have the poisoning of the heroine, and certainly not in Tosca, where you have her jumping off of the Castel Sant'Angelo. So you do it again like Verismo. You're going to have little changes here and there. You don't always follow the exact pattern. So he's going to be extremely successful with this. His plays are translated, performed all over the continent, even in London, but the critics don't care for him much. George Bernard Shaw will even coin a term, sardoodledom, as a reference to his work. But he was the one that was laughing last as he went to the bank to cash his royalty checks. So it'll be his Fedora, which is written in 1882 and premiered, was written for Sarah Bernhardt. A number of his later plays will be, and Tosca, which comes in 1887. So in the case of Giordano, he composes it between 1897 and 1898, premieres 1898, it's in 3 acts, and the librettist was one Arturo Colautti, who wrote some dozen or so libretti, was also a political writer. Which I say at this point, we should listen to some music. I'm just blabbing here. I'll just play the introduction to the opera, which is very pleasant, though things after that are not going to be very pleasant. And it is the following, I hope. So, a little unusual in this opera is that it takes place in 3 different countries. So, it's the year of 1881. We're in St. Petersburg, and we're introduced to the Princess Fedora Razumov. I think that's right. Romazov, sorry. And this begins as a murder mystery. She's in the home of her fiancé, one Vladimir Andreevich, and she's waiting for him to come home, and he comes home, but he's in a stretcher and he's mortally wounded and then expires in front of her. So now the mystery, who did this? And we have a police chief, Mr. Grech, Grech, is trying to get to the bottom of it, and he's interviewing everyone in the household, the servants, the coachman. And somebody had noticed that a man had left the house and had taken a letter with him. And the line of thought is that this person was one Count Loris Ipanov, though at this point there's no real proof, but Fedora pretty much has it in her mind that he was responsible. And it's believed that the cause was a political one, that Loris was a nihilist. So that's pretty much it for Act 1. Fedora is going to pledge vengeance on Loris and try to track him down. I should add, this is a very short opera. It's barely 90 minutes long, and yet still divided into 3 acts. And that takes us to the beginning of Act 2, and now we're in Paris. And I'll play the introduction. One thing that Giordano does as a part of this realism bit, or Verismo, is he likes to take tunes that fit into the contemporary times that are being described. So if we're in Paris, well, why not a Parisian waltz? And so he begins Act 2 with this Parisian waltz, which is the following. So we're in the home of Fedora, and she has tracked down Loris and has invited him to her house, and she's holding a big party, and she wants to expose him in front of her guests. That's the plan. Also invited to the party is a diplomat by name of de Sérieux, and a lady friend, Olga Sukharov, who brings along with her a Polish pianist who professes to be a nephew of Chopin. Now, there'll be a moment where Loris arrives, and that's when he sings his great aria because he's in love with Fedora. And they're going to sit down and have a chat. And while they're chatting, and she's asking him questions, trying to get him to admit that he murdered her husband, we have this pianist playing one of his own nocturnes. It's not a nocturne by Chopin, but by this pianist, in fact, by Giordano. And it's kind of an unusual moment where they're singing while this pianist is playing in the background. So I thought I would just play you that because this is what Puccini is going to do in one of his later operas. This is... can't read my own handwriting.
Se innocente sei davvero crederà. Et qui propor Verdi si la mortà, contaminato dal terribile sospetto, e il tuo nome, il turpe nome d'un assassino. Innocente. Rispondi, rispondi, Fedora amate. Sì, t'amo, t'amo. Ma parla, parla. Che bene, sì, l'uccisi, ed ora, grandi figlioli, disgrazia, castigo, e che ne sai tu? Nulla io so. Mi sfugge, ma dove te vai? Vuoi dunque lasciarmi nel dubbio? Che giova, non ami, t'incuto ribrezzo. Rifletti, la prima sorpresa. Chiamarmi assassina potesti. Il grido del sangue, ma poi il cuore risponde. Chissà che si benedetta. Parla in mezzo a una festa, vuoi darti la prova domani, qui stesso. Stanotte risponde, verrai.
So as I said, Puccini is going to take this. This is rather a novel idea on the part of Giordano. Not the first time it's happened. I remember in La Fille de Cagimont of Donizetti in 1840, there's a piano on stage. Marie is being accompanied in a singing lesson. But this is a little different use of the piano. It's really like an accompaniment to their conversation. So with Puccini, this comes from his opera La Rondine, and we're in Paris in a salon, and a poet is asked to sing a love song, and he sings his love song, but accompanies himself on the piano. And I would think that Puccini got this idea from Giordano.
Il bel sogno di Doretta poté indovinar, il suo mistero nessun mai scoprì. Un bel giorno il re la bimba volle avvicinar. Se tu a me credi, se tu a me cedi, ti farò ricca. Ah, creatura, dolce incanto, la tua paura, il tepido tuo pianto ora sparirà.
Puccini was very much interested in contemporary music, and I'm certain when he heard Fedora and picked up on this idea and did the same so in La Rondine, which comes a bit later, as I said, 1917. Oh, where am I going? So during this conversation, during this nocturne by the Chopin nephew, you've got Fedora interrogating Loris, who admits that he is a fugitive from Russia because he has murdered someone. Ah, thinks she. And at the same moment, a telegram comes in saying that there has been an assassination plot on the life of Alexander II, the Tsar. This is 1881, and in fact, the Tsar was assassinated. So again, we're back to this realism thing. We're using a true historical backdrop for the plot. And so once again, hearing that there was an attempt on Alexander's life, she thinks it's Locris, and again, that this is a political crime. Locris says, once all the guests have left, I will tell you the whole story. And here you have one of these shockers, I guess. Doesn't seem very shocking, but it's kind of a shocking turn of event in the play. Locris admits to killing Andreevich, but it wasn't for political reasons. It's because he had been engaged to a young country girl, a poor country girl, against the wishes of his wealthy family, his account. and that she had an affair with Vladimir Andreevich, who you recall was the fiance of Fedora. So there was no political crime committed here. It was a crime of revenge out of love. So Fedora, though, unfortunately, after this telegram and the initial conversation with Locris, has written a letter to the police inspector, Grek, saying Locris is the man. And the police inspector is now going to surround the house with his men ready to take into captivity Locris. Well, now her heart changes. She falls in love with Locris. And I don't know what happens to the police. This isn't clear, but she tells Locris to spend the night with her. And that's the end of Act 2. Act 3, we are now in the Bernese Oberland, which is in Switzerland. And Locris and Fedora are living together. And I guess very much in love. I've got to get the right disc in. And it begins with an orchestral bit and then some chorus, and what we call a rance des vaches. And this is what the shepherds sing or play in Switzerland when they're bringing the cows in at night to bed them down in the barn. Very famous rance des vaches is in the William Tell overture, not the Lone Ranger bit, but at the very beginning, the tune that you hear on the English horn is a rance des vaches, because of course William Tell takes place in Switzerland. So this is an Italian version of a rance des vaches, and again, we're having Giordano trying to add some local color to this. I don't know if you've ever been to the Bernese Oberland, this extraordinary part of Switzerland, the Alps, dominated by 3 mountains, the Münch, the Eiger, and the Jungfrau. Stunning, absolutely stunning. You can go to the village of Muren, which is 8,000 feet high, and you're right opposite them. And then late afternoon, if you're lucky, depending on atmospheric conditions, the snow becomes pink. It's called alpine glow. It's truly spectacular, but this is where they're living. Here is the rance des vaches, the opening of Act 3. So here we are in the Alps, Fedora and Loris, much in love. Unfortunately, the letter that she had written to Grek about the guilty Loris has made its way back to Russia. And the father of Vladimir Andreevich, in case you're confused, the former fiancé, murdered fiancé of Fedora, is going to take out his revenge on Loris's family. And he has the brother of Loris arrested, thrown into prison, and has him drowned in prison. And the mother of Loris is so despondent, she dies. Loris finds out about this. Fedora admits that she sent that letter, but before she knew the real reasons why he had murdered her fiancé. Nevertheless, Loris curses her, and she takes poison, and she dies. End of opera. Very dramatic. Very difficult to end on a positive note, so I thought I would go back to Act 2, and it's, again, another example of Giordano adding some local color to his work. He does an imitation Russian song. It's called the Russian canzonetta, and it's sung by one of the guests who's Russian at the party being given by Fedora. And it's rather cheerful, so it might be a nice way to end, even though it's Act 2, not Act 3. So it is the following. And it sounds very Russian.
Due volte doppiamente adorabili do stil, essa è la vera donna, deva la figlia vera. Con le dolcezze, gli impeti, le audacie e le viltà, l'ali e gli artigli, le sposi e le frodi, pronta a immolarsi e facile a tradire. Tutto il suo sesso in lei, tutto l'essere umano, un altare, un abisso, un Angelo e serpe, zingara, vergina, sol d'oriente, gelo, boreale. Ecco la donna rossa, con le dolcezze, gli impeti, le audacie e le viltà, pronta a immolarsi, facile a tradire, ecco la donna rossa. Ed ecco il video.
So that's it for Fedora. In case you're interested, the tenor you heard and the soprano you heard, I never can pronounce her name, Angela Gheorghiu, a Romanian girl, who was the wife of Alania, the French tenor, for a while, and the tenor was Placido Domingo. Before I take questions, I would like to promote my next presentation, and it's the unknown Schubert. Of course, everybody knows Schubert today, but back during his lifetime, very few people knew who he was, and his music wasn't being performed. The numbers are incredible. Some 20 years of composition, over 1,400 works composed, and only 68 got public performances. Only a third were published in his lifetime, and it would take decades for his symphonies to be heard. They were never performed during his lifetime, decades for them to be performed. other orchestra works, chamber works, songs. He was known as a song composer, about 40 songs, and he wrote over 700. It's one of the most tragic stories in music history, and quite fascinating. And of course, then we'll listen to some of the works in question. So anyway, are there any questions?